Arthur Conan Doyle and ophthalmology. Conan Doyle, creator of the famous detective Sherlock Holmes, and his faithful companion Dr. Watson, was a medical doctor, as many know. Not everyone is aware that he specialized in ophthalmology. Arthur Conan Doyle studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh. Professor Joseph Bell, who was one of his professors, used method of observation and deduction in the study of diseases, and his patients' study of every element and analysis of each symptom, followed by a scientific summary that led to the diagnosis. This was the approach of Professor Bell. It impressed Conan Doyle so much that he drew inspiration from these qualities to describe later Sherlock Holmes' brilliant deductions. It cannot be said that it was a scientific method, but certainly it was a method philosophically very close to that of Descartes, 1636. Before graduating, Conan Doyle embarked as a ship doctor on a whaler ship, Hope, off the coast of Greenland. And after graduation, he embarked again as a ship doctor on a passenger steamer, the steamship Mayumba, en route to English West Africa. During the trip, he fell ill, suffering a terrible fever, probably malaria. He obtained the Bachelor of Medicine in 1881 and subsequently obtained his medical degree, MD, in 1885 with a thesis on progressive ataxia, that is a neurological disease of the spinal cord. In 1881, Conan Doyle opened a medical office in Portsmouth where he worked as a general practitioner, and he lived in a very small, modest house where a room was used as a study. His patients suffered mainly of orthoptic problems, and he looked after children's disease. It was for him a pleasant period where he practiced medicine with pleasure, taking care of clients of a modest condition. His first contact with ophthalmology. While working as a general practitioner, Doyle befriended a young ophthalmologist, Vernon Ford, who worked in the eye and ear unit of Portsmouth Hospital. Ford taught him how to prescribe glasses, perform refraction, and examination of the fundus of the eye. He attended the eye unit to obtain approval to examine eyes and prescribe lenses. Conan Doyle's ophthalmology skills were never at high level. He never performed even the simplest ophthalmologic surgery, but he was interested enough in the specialty to decide to travel to Austria and France to attend famous eye departments. In Vienna, he attended the ophthalmology department of the General Hospital for 6 months. Unfortunately, the pleasures of the city and the presence of his young wife, and the fact that he spoke very little German, led him to attend the department very little, while on the contrary, he assiduously frequented the beauties of the city. He remained in Vienna only 3 months. Returning to England, Conan Doyle stopped in Paris a few weeks to follow the clinics of Edmund Landolt. This great ophthalmologist is still known for his description of some eye disease and for his optotyped form of broken rings for children and illiterate examination. We still use today Landolt optotype. Conan Doyle enrolled in the Ophthalmological Society of the United Kingdom. we must recognize that his ophthalmology was never a high standard. He merely prescribed glasses. He did never perform any surgery, but he hoped to earn his life by doing refraction, fundus examination, and prescribing glasses. His office on Harley Street was large and elegant, and he had a doctor's office and a writing room. Unfortunately, he had almost no patients, and therefore a lot of time to write. His literary career soon overtook his medical career, but he made many references to medicine and to ophthalmology in particular in his writings. Another point about Conan Doyle's interest in medicine is that when his wife fell ill with tuberculosis, he had to move to the Swiss mountains. At that time, he spoke against the famous Professor Robert Koch, who created the tuberculin, describing it as a possible cure for tuberculosis. Conan Doyle questioned tuberculin as a cure, but acknowledged its usefulness for diagnosing the disease. Tuberculin is still used today for the diagnosis of tuberculosis. His short path in ophthalmology gave him medical material to use in his books. His excursion in ophthalmology was therefore a success, since it allowed him to use his knowledge in pathology and surgery in numerous stories. During his waiting period of patients, he began to write short stories, including one about Detective Sherlock Holmes. This short story was accepted by the famous magazine The Strand, and this encouraged him to abandon completely medicine to earn a living with writing. Sherlock Holmes aroused worldwide interest and the passion of many readers. In order to be able to devote himself to other literary works, Conan Doyle in 1893 decided to make Holmes die in the Reichenbach Falls in Switzerland, dragging with him his arch enemy, Professor Moriarty. Conan Doyle thought he had got rid of Sherlock Holmes, but his disappearance caused such a revolt among British and American readers and publishers that he was obliged to find a literary trick to make him reappear in a new book series. Conan Doyle wrote about ophthalmology and in tales outside Sherlock Holmes. By example, The Doctor of Hoyland. In this story, which is part of a collection of tales about doctors, he describes a young doctor, James Ripley, who spent his nights performing glaucoma and cataract surgery on sheep's eyes provided from the village butcher. He performed iridectomies and cataract extraction. To the horror of her home owner and maid who had to clean up, the surgery remains the next morning. Interestingly, in this story, Dr. Ripley is shocked to see that a young woman doctor of medicine comes to work in the same village. He is appalled by the fact that a woman does medicine and says it clearly. Women lose their privilege if they usurp the place of opposite sex. They cannot be woman and a doctor together. Medicine is not a profession suitable for women because it makes them masculine. The young woman doctor simply raised her eyes and smiled. Dr. Ripley added that obviously a masculine woman is harm. In another tale in Outside Sherlock Holmes Adventures, in the book Red Lamp, a highly reputed medical specialist, Dr. Selby, receives a visit of a patient suffering of interstitial keratitis. When the doctor explains the disease and the dangers that arise to the patient lives desperate and commits suicide by throwing himself under the wheels of the carriage. As we know, the adventures of Sherlock Holmes are reported by Dr. Watson, who was the first co-tenant of the famous detective in the well-known Baker Street 221B apartment. Later, Dr. Watson became a friend and collaborator of Sherlock, who loved to explain his deductions to him during the investigations. It is clear from Conan Doyle's books that Dr. Watson graduated in 1878 before serving as a military doctor in the Colonial Army Health Corps. He had the opportunity to serve in the wars in Afghanistan against the Taliban and in India. Dr. Watson had a particular interest in ophthalmology and perhaps had followed some courses in Moorfield Hospital and St. Bartholomew Hospital. We had the famous ophthalmology department. We see him here during his stay in India. But now we come to the most important work in Conan Doyle about ophthalmology. Sherlock Holmes talks about cataract surgery at least 3 times in his stories. In the study in Scarlet, Sherlock Holmes' first adventure, Dr. Watson writes, Lauriston Garden number 3 had an ominous aspect with 3 rows of dismantled and melancholy windows, as you can see here in this house. These windows were empty and bleak, with the exception here and there of rented sign, which had developed like a cataract on fogged glass. Every ophthalmologist will recognize here the description of the anterior or posterior polar cataract, since it is occupied only the central part of the window, as we see here. And this is polar cataract. We can therefore think that Dr. Watson, the look of the rent sign placed on the dirty window plate, reminded him of a posterior polar cataract in the context of a posterior cup cataract. Another quote about cataract is extracted from the story The Empty House. Mr. Ronald Adair was the second son of the Earl of Maynooth, the governor of one of the Australian colonies. Adair's mother had returned from Australia to undergo cataract surgery, and her son and her daughter Hilda lived in Park Lane. Obviously, at the end of the 19th century, in Australia, there were no famous ophthalmologists capable of operating a cataract correctly, or Adair's mother did not trust Australian colleagues. And therefore, she had faced a very long journey to be examined and then operated by a renowned ophthalmologist from Harley Street in London. A third reference to the cataract operation is the Silver Blaze Adventure racehorse, which in a very important event started to limp. He had been injured by an unfair competitor with a tool so thin that it was invisible to everyone except Sherlock Holmes. The wound was inflicted with a very thin chisel called by the ophthalmologist cataract knife. As you can see here, this is a cataract knife of the time of Sherlock Holmes with an ivory handle. Conan Doyle detective stories often turn on medical and philosophical principles. Their plots often seem like extended medical analysis, moving from hypothesis to diagnosis through the accumulation of facts and Holmes' characteristic deductive reasoning. We cannot say that Sherlock Holmes' deductive reasoning was a scientific method, but certainly It was a method philosophically very close to that of Descartes in the Discours de la méthode, 1637. Thank you.